I think so.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks everyone for...
Sorry, just a minute, please. We want to start by paying our respect and acknowledging the traditional owner of the land. And I would like to introduce our first presenter as well. And this is about teaching versus engaging. Is it a contest or just a progressive move towards improving student outcome? So I invite Associate Professor David Rosenbaum and Professor Elizabeth.
Yep, Moore.
Sorry, Elizabeth Moore. Yes, sorry. To start their presentation, and please complete it within 20 minutes. I'll be looking at the time as well. Thank you.
Thanks. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we present and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and David and I are on Gadigal country. So thank you very much. I'm also a proud alumnus of CQ University, so it's a particular pleasure to actually be presenting at what is a very excellent conference every year. Thanks. Well, our focus is action learning, and as the quote says, it is a key approach to active learning and enhancing engagement. And I think given the needs in the pandemic, but actually I think even earlier, a challenge, especially in online learning, is how best to educate students in the online environment that enables engagement, promotes interactive learning, and especially reduces isolation among peers and teaching staff, and we've seen a lot of that. The VUCAD environment, what is that? Well, the change required across teaching and learning pedagogies, assessments, and including exams, diverse environments, student and staff capacities, and new technical, regulatory, policy and administrative processes and supports have been challenged in what is the volatile, uncertain, competitive, etc. environment in which we live. We can't really go back to where we were before, though people keep speaking about, going back to the normal life of higher education. We have to move forward away from didactic classes to interacting much more with students and with each other. And so we have to move from an instructive lecture-centred mode towards a much more constructive student-centred orientation to learning and teaching. So we need, I think, now to incorporate a different mindset, to put on a different set of glasses to learning and teaching as we confront, despite Freedom Days in New South Wales yesterday, as we all confront a very unpredictable future, not just because of COVID, because I think of global tensions about higher education. I think some strategies, thanks David, some strategies for enhancing student engagement are many. I've just put some of them down there. Gamification, gaming, designing elements and principles for education. Audio enhanced discussion, modes of making audio content online. Audience response systems, and many of you have been using those in conferences, where we can actually interact beyond just the chat, if you like, or the questions, to actually real-time posting of our views of things using clicker devices. The web-based designed platform for digital aspects of study, social media and all its problems, Snapchat, WhatsApp, those sorts of things. The move now to blended online learning, combining face-to-face and online. And then the very rapid move, I think, now to understanding that within the classroom, we have to co-create curriculum and also co-design assessments and ensure that students are our partners in moving forward. Improve feedback and feed forward. The feedback that we get after assignments and the feed forward that we do prior to assignments to ensure that the students get the best learning experience. And of course, all of us are interested in using real life situations in authentic assessments and also in work integrated learning. Many universities are upping the services that they provide. And as I mentioned, all of us are using collaboration with students to up the ante in terms of student engagement. Action learning for us is one tested solution for our toolkit of teaching into the future. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Elizabeth. What I'd like to do is I'd like to actually whet your appetite by advancing 2 slides and providing you with some feedback from students that were involved in 2 action learning trials that I was running at a different institution, but which we are now implementing in my current institution. And then I'll go back and give you some more in-depth insights into what we were actually trying to achieve from a process point of view in action learning. So let's set the scene. There were 2 international student cohorts that were involved in an undergraduate program and in a postgraduate program. At the undergraduate level, there were 35 students and the subject was entitled Business Ethics. At the postgraduate level, there were 62 students and the subject was entitled Leadership and Ethical Behavior. Now, there's quite a bit of stats that we have in relation to the surveys that these students completed. This is actually going to be the subject of a paper that Elizabeth and I are currently working on. But if I summarize these at a very, very high level, just to give you some insights from the students' perspective, the figures are quite impressive. The responses were quite impressive. 85% of the respondents either strongly agreed or agreed with the view that action learning process was beneficial to improving their knowledge in the subject and or that it had a positive impact on their personal learning experience in their subject. 75% of respondents felt that the most beneficial part of the process was insightful questioning, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And 72% of respondents felt that the action learning process actually should be adopted throughout all of the subjects in their course. In both cases, it was only in one subject in each of their programs. And I've included some of the comments from the students in the survey, which are also, I think, quite telling and informative. One student, it helps making the class interactive in a virtual environment. Another one, enhances my critical thinking skills. And we all love students who can actually display critical thinking. The reflection process gives me the opportunity to think more deeply about my learning experiences. Another, it was exciting because it was different to anything else I'd done throughout my course. And another, it requires students to be far more engaged with the class and the material. Another one, this learning journey has been awesome. Thanks for including us in the process. And one student wrote, the reflective learning log, which I'll talk about in a moment, takes us to a new level. So I think it's fair to say that these sort of comments and these sort of results point to a conclusion that we're on the right track with this process. So let's go back and let me talk a little bit in more detail about what we're actually doing with action learning. For those of you who are familiar with action learning, it's actually equation-based. Given its origins back in the 1940s by Professor Reg Ravens in the UK, who was an engineer. He wasn't a management guru or an education guru. He was a professor of engineering. And he was charged with reinvigorating the coal industry after UK came out of World War II. So that was the context within which he was operating. And the equation that was developed eventually with action learning was that learning had three components to it. One component was what was referred to as programmed knowledge, which was P. Another component was referred to as Q, insightful questioning. And the third component, which actually came later than Reg Ravens, but by Professor Marquand in the US in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s, was R, reflection. So we put these things together, and this is how we're trying to engage with students in terms of enhancing their skills and getting them to engage with each other, within the class, and of course, with the lecturer and the tutor. And whilst this was done in a virtual environment, it has the exact same application and the exact same processes, whether it's virtual or face-to-face. So let's look at program knowledge. What was program knowledge? From a student's point of view, we're focusing on the skills that are necessary in understanding what the existing theory is, and therefore them being able to research that existing literature and applying that existing knowledge to specific problems. We then go to the insightful question. And what's the insightful questioning about? Well, the insightful questioning is developing the questioning skills that promote deep thinking rather than very shallow thinking, and identifying as a result of that the knowledge gaps through the questioning process. And reflection is well regarded and well spoken of in literature for decades now. Developing reflection skills at both the informal as well as the formal levels, understanding how reflection processes is part of problem solving, understanding how reflection can actually help clarify the parameters of the problem and therefore aid its solution. Understanding how reflection aids the process of identifying knowledge gaps and how these can be addressed. And a very interesting aspect of reflection, that is using it to understand self, understanding yourself, in this case, as a student. And so how was this put together in terms of the two case studies that we ran and the implementations that we're now looking at putting in place at the King's Own Institute? What we did is we put together groups, and in the terminology of action learning, these are referred to as action learning sets, usually around about 8 students, a maximum of 10 at the extreme outside. And of course, this was done in a virtual environment. This was done using the Zoom breakout rooms. And each group is given a challenge, a problem that they have to address. And the problem is such, and it's defined in such a way within the context of their course, such that they just can't look up their textbook to find the answer. They can't just refer to the PowerPoint slides from the lecture to determine the answer. They need to spend time in researching the problem and obtaining more literature and more input from a range of different sources. Each week, and of course they're given this material in advance, each week one member of each group then has to provide a presentation to the rest of the group. That presentation is effectively a problem-solving process, and they have to present what they believe to be a potential response to the challenge or the problem. They then effectively sit back, and the other members of the group need to ask those questions, questions which are not one-dimensional, questions which don't have a yes or no answer, questions which actually get the presenter to have to sit back and think. How to interpret that question? What do I do with that question? Where can I go with that question? What else do I need to analyze in order to get some feedback onto that question? And of course, they then spend this reflection time where they are thinking about the question being asked, thinking about the material they've presented, and what are they going to do in relation to responding to that. This became an iterative process. And if we look at this from a formal reflection process, this is where we introduced the reflective learning logs, which were part of the assessment process. One of the beauties about reflective learning logs, and you can look up Google and come up with literally tens and thousands of examples of reflective learning logs that are used not only in commercial world, but also in higher education. And so these have to be designed as in a bespoke manner for each subject that you're looking at implementing this. And one of the beauties of the reflective learning log, it's written in the first tense. It's all about me, I, the student, and therefore it reduces the prospect of plagiarism. It's very difficult to plagiarize something about yourself. And so there is an added benefit to this process. And as a general rule in the undergraduate, the reflective learning logs usually represented anywhere between 10 to 15% of their total assessments. And at the postgraduate level, anywhere between 15 and 25%, depending on word counts. And of course, there's no referencing in this. This is all about responding to a range of reflective questions. So this is how we introduced action learning, and this is how it's currently looking at being introduced. And in the current environment that we're looking at, it is being introduced in a law subject, and it's being introduced in an accounting subject. Because there are some who suggest that, the more technical the subject becomes, the less relevant this approach is. And hence, some people saying, well, it's understandable that it was successful as it was in subjects such as business ethics, which is quite esoteric, and leadership and ethical behavior, which potentially is equally so. So this is now being rolled out trialed in a law subject, and as I said, in an accounting subject. And the next level of research, which will be incorporated into this article that Elizabeth and I are currently developing, will be looking at not just the reaction from the student's perspective, but also the reaction from the lecturer, from the teacher's perspective. What did they go through as part of designing and implementing this, especially when they had never come across action learning or an element of it before? So that is the background for how we achieved the results that are there in the slide in front of you. So I think that gets us pretty well close to the time. Happy to take any questions that you might have.
I was just going to say that in answer to the question that we posed about teaching versus engaging, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I guess what we're proposing is that we have engaging teaching through action learning. And it takes additional effort, but it's well worth the effort, as David suggested, both from the perspective of the academic teaching and especially from the students. Nevertheless, some of the international research shows that, and the research is done across things such as maths, accounting, not just the organisation behaviour type subjects. The research shows that many institutions are a bit concerned about implementing action learning because it threatens the traditional, if you like, before COVID approach. And it is very, very student-centred. We believe in it.
Very true.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful and enlightening presentation, especially on action learning, which is very new to many of us, especially in the learning and teaching platforms. You are well within time. You still have 2 minutes left from the 20 minutes. And I would like others to now join in the conversation. You can leave your question in the chat, or please raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you.
I think we've shocked them, David.
I think you have done such a wonderful job.
No, it's a very short time to go over what is,
I have several questions in the chat, though, or comments, I would say. One I can see is from Afroz. Fundamental science units are often about rote learning. All right. Rote learning equation and solving problems. How do I incorporate deep learning or critical thinking in my teaching?
Look, that's a really, really good question. And the reality is that in answering or addressing a problem, even within the context of a science unit, there is a need to take a more holistic view to resolving these sort of questions. And whilst the base of many of these questions may be formulaic based, they may be a scientific issue, they will all have, as a general rule, implications which are far broader than the science. And therefore, it is worthwhile in looking at this process of the questioning and the reflection in order to gain these further insights. And a perfect case in point is actually what's happening with climate change. Climate change is a science-based problem, but it has far, far broader implications from a societal point of view, human interaction point of view, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a perfect example where you can't just look at something from one angle, even though it may be science, there are other implications associated with it. And of course, the other perfect example, which is we're living through right now, is COVID. COVID is a health-related challenge, which has huge social implications and ramifications because we're living through it. So I think that's it's a good question. And I think it's because of this broader context that you need to look at these things.
But even without the broader context, we would never have developments in science if people weren't reflecting and questioning. And I think to help students reflect and question is one of the greatest gifts that we can give students for lifelong learning.
Yes, I have another question. I think that's from Kate. Do you know if there is much work being done with this approach in health disciplines such as nursing, paramedic, and biomedical sciences?
Yes, again, that's a very good question. And the short answer to that is yes. Action learning is actually very, very prevalent, especially in nursing. There's an entire division, I understand, within the health system in Victoria. Well, when I say entire division, there's a team that's working on action learning approaches in nursing in Victoria. I'm also aware that there are larger teams in the NHS in the United Kingdom who are also looking at action learning as a way of implementing new initiatives, designing and implementing new initiatives throughout the NHS. So absolutely.
All right. So now, David and Elizabeth, thank you very much. You have many compliments in the chat from Mari and Sujata, I think. So we will move on to the next presenter. If you have any more question for Professor Elizabeth and David, you can definitely leave it in the chat room. So I will...
Sudhana, we're
yes.
always happy for people to email us if you want further
Yes,
information.
absolutely. So Elizabeth, can you please keep your email address in the chat room as well again?